This conference will now be recorded.
I'm a policy fellow with GeoBlue Planet, and welcome to session 2 of our workshop series. Today we'll be talking about sustainable fisheries management of tuna, challenges and solutions. I'm joined by GeoBlue Planet Executive Director Emily Smale, as well as our speakers today, Mauricio Ortiz from ICCAT, Guillermo Compean from IATTC, and Alejandro Aganuzzi. Excuse me. So as I said, this is our second session of our series, and there's 5 of them total. And if you're interested to hear more about fisheries management, especially in the upcoming weeks when we focus more on Earth observations, visit our website, geoblueplanet.org/EO4Tuna for the schedule, and feel free to register the same way you did for today, and we hope to see you for a later date. So now I welcome our first presenter, Mauricio Ortiz. And first I will stop sharing my screen and make you a presenter. So Dr. Mauricio Ortiz is the head of the Department of Research and Statistics at ICCAT Secretariat. He has a master's degree in marine biology and physiology and a doctoral degree in fisheries biology and population dynamics, both from the University of Miami. He's been working with highly migratory species since 2001 as part of the NOAA laboratory in Miami, and since 2010 at the ICCAT Secretariat. Main areas of research include stock assessment and population dynamics of tunas and tuna-like species in the Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea, including bluefin tuna, yellowfin, big-eye tuna, swordfish, and Atlantic billfishes. And today he'll be sharing his work on sustainable fisheries management of tuna, challenges and solutions, the ICCAT perspective. Thank you, Mauricio.
Thank you very much, Leah, for the introduction. And please, if you can confirm, then you can see the screen and hear the voice.
Yes, I could see your screen and hear your voice.
Thank you very much. And first of all, welcome to everybody to this second session of the workshops. And first, I want to thank Leah and the GeoBlue Planet initiative for organizing this interesting and important workshop on sustainable fisheries for the worldwide tuna species. In behalf of ICCAT, the scientific group of ICCAT, the ACRS, and the Secretariat would like to present a brief summary on the ongoing work that ICCAT is doing in response to the sustainable management of tuna fisheries associated with climate changes, impacts, and in the Atlantic Ocean in particular. Oops, let me move to the next slide. So just a brief introduction. ICCAT is an intergovernmental fishery organization with the responsibility for the management and the conservation of the tuna and tuna-like fishery resources in the Atlantic Ocean and its adjacent seas. And in this regard, is particularly important the Mediterranean Sea. This organization was created with the signature of the convention back in 1966 in Rio de Janeiro. The text of the convention has actually been recently updated or amendment, and it was adopted in 2019 in Palma de Mallorca with important changes, in particular addressing ecosystems, conservation of biodiversity, and overall sustainability of highly migratory fisheries in the Atlantic Ocean. ICCAT counts currently with 53 full contracting parties, plus 6 cooperating parties, of which about 75% are classified as developing countries. And these are the main players in the fisheries in the Atlantic. The main objective of the convention is to maintain the population of the tuna and tuna-like species at the levels that permit the maximum sustainable catch for food and other purposes. ICCAT manages most of the Atlantic tuna and tuna-like resources is based on the recommendations from the scientific committee, or called the ACRS. At the present, most of the advice is provided as a result of the single stock assessments approach. So routinely, the ACRS evaluates the most important stocks. And as a summary, in the beginning of 2020, about 25 stock units have been evaluated by the ICCAT. Of these, about 11 stocks of 44% are below the biomass that will produce the maximum sustainable yield, which is the common reference point for most of the stocks. Of these, also 5 stocks also experience high rates of fishing mortality, basically a concept of overfishing. And of those 5 stocks also, there is a really high level of uncertainty in the evaluations that precludes to provide a status determination in some of the components of the stock. What I want to present in this slide is a summary, both historically and at the present, of the current status of the most important species or species that have been evaluated throughout the ACRS, the scientific groups. Really, the picture started in 1950 up to 2018, and as you see, we use these plots of the Kobe matrix, which basically is a relation between the fishing mortality and the biomass based on the reference points of 5-MSY or BRB-MSY, some reference points, B ratios and F ratios. See, back in the 1970s, most of the stock were in a relatively healthy condition. They were in the green quadrant of the Kobe plot. However, back in 1975, in the 1980s, immediately with the development of most of the major fisheries in the Atlantic and the increased participation of several fleets, the status is starting to worsen. And it kind of got to the worst situation at the end of the last century, when 2000, where about 50% of the stocks were in critical condition with the high levels of overfishing going on and the biomass reducing substantially. Since then, the stocks had started slowly but recovering, in part thanks to the advice of the scientific community, the scientific ACRS group, but also because of the implementation of strong management regulations in the Atlantic. To your left, what you have is the same plot, but looking at the last year, 2019, for which compiled this information and indicates the status of most of the stock. Most of the major fisheries has been in a recovery plan, and they are recovered, but still there are some of them that are overfish and overfishing going on. What happened is that in this process, basically in the history of the management, the ACRS, but also ICCAT, has recognized the important and large uncertainty that in several of these assessments is related in particular to environmental factors that are either affecting directly the stocks, or in some situations are a combination of factors, environmental factors that are more in some changes. Some of the examples we had are, for example, the indicators of a regime shift in the North Atlantic that has impacted, in particular, the recruitment trends and levels of Western Atlantic bluefin tuna. This kind of regime shift has been trying to be associated with some climatic and oceanographic conditions in the North Atlantic. In similar fashion, for example, in the case of swordfish, there has been changes in distribution and availability of the resources to the main fleets associated with some long-term climatic oscillations such as El Nino, the ENSO events in the North Atlantic. And this has been proved to be an important component that affect these particularly stocks, the North Atlantic swordfish. There are also some other evidence from the recent reappearance of bluefin tuna of the northern latitudes, north coast of Norway and Iceland, as well other tropical species being caught in northern latitudes. And in this case, if you recall the presentation from our colleagues in the first session of this workshop, there is this movement towards the poles of their different species in response to the climatic changes. It's obvious that these issues several of these issues cannot be fully addressed with a single stock approach evaluation systems. Thus, the ACRS has recommended to move to more integrated approaches of a stock status evaluation that will allow to consider different and diverse sources of uncertainty, and at the same time to be able to provide a more robust management advice in lieu of these uncertainties. Basically, these are the premises for what we refer in fishery science and a management strategy evaluation approach, or MSC, that has been recently implemented in different fisheries around the world. So the ACRS made this recommendation several years ago, and in response, ICCAT actually in 2016 approved and started to move towards the process of implementing and the adoption of the management strategy evaluation protocols for important stocks such as the Atlantic bluefin tuna, the North Atlantic albacore, the North Atlantic swordfish, and the Atlantic tropical tunas, which includes fisheries for yellowfin, big-eyed tuna, and skipjack tunas in the Atlantic. In 2016, the Commission also adopted an MSC roadmap that is basically the work plan designed for the next 10, 15 years to how to develop, implement, and these MSE protocols. This involves obviously development, evaluation, the stakeholders dialogue, and the implementation processes for the species. Basically, one of the concepts here is to be able to integrate all levels of uncertainty and to be able to provide a more robust advice. At the present, currently means ICCAT has adopted a management strategy rule, basically for northern albacore, which is a harvest control rule as part of the MSC process. And the recommended TAD that has been adopted since 2018 is based on the application of these harvest control rules. In the other two groups, in the MSC process for Atlantic bluefin tuna and North Atlantic swordfish are ongoing. Most of the operating models, basic operating models, are developed already, and they are currently in the process to evaluating different candidates of management procedures for discussion with the stakeholders and testing those management procedures. One of the processes in the case of the tropical tunas is still in the initial development stages. Why is important this MSE approach? It's important in the sense that it allows to include different levels of uncertainty, both the past, current uncertainty, but also future uncertainty, because it creates a framework for operating and for testing these levels of uncertainty. In particularly, in the case of ecosystem or oceanographic related factors that affect that, the operating models, the different operating models allowed for the groups, for the scientific groups, to test how these factors may potentially affect the sustainability of the stocks. That's the case, for example, in the case of bluefin tuna. That's what we want to have an example here. We recently tested about 18 management plan being seen as a candidates over a grid of 92 operating models. 92 correspond to the basic operation, the dynamics of the population, where different levels of uncertainty are included. This type of grid that is called, it reflects basically all the main sources of uncertainty in the case of Atlantic bluefin tuna. And interestingly enough, testing all these operating models and all this over the grid, over all this level of uncertainty, one of the factors in this case, the so-called regime shift, which is the one who reflects those changes in the recruitment capacity of the stock, it turns out to be one of the main factors that determine the results of seeing in the testing evaluations. In other words, it's a factor that it accounts at least for 23% of the total variability explained in the models. Again, the advantage with this MSC approach is that it allows to have a framework to test different states of nature and to evaluate what type of management procedures will be more robust in those cases. So that's in general from the point of view of the scientists and single stock approaches, but also the ICCAT has moved into the ecosystem approach because in a way already has been recognized the importance of the integrated ecosystem approach resources in the Atlantic. And in 2015, the Commission approved a resolution concerning the application of an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. That was the first step into moving into this approach. And since then, I started working, and the most important actually has been the inclusion in the recent amendment of the convention of the text of the convention of the components of environment in their actual text of the convention, in particular in Article 4. I just highlighted the lower part of this article where it's stated that in the need to include the oceanographic of the environment and the effects of the natural and human factors into the studies and management of the ICCAT resources, the species. More in detail, that particular amendment that was approved in Palma de Mallorca last year, so almost exactly a year ago, 2019, notice that in Article 4, apply the precautionary approach and an ecosystem approach to fisheries management in accordance with the relevant international agreed standards and an appropriate recommended practices and procedures. Why is this important? Also, there is component, as highlighted here, point C, protect biodiversity and marine environment. This is important because it basically creates the legal framework within an ICCAT for which the ecosystems approach can be developed and applied to the different resources in ICCAT. At the level of the ACRS, the scientific community in ICCAT, this process has started also to basically back in 2016 and is primarily a subcommittee, the subcommittee of ecosystems and ICCAT, who has taken the lead in developing the plans, the approaches, etc., for the implementation of an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. We really is just started. This work is obviously is a complex and a large task, and they have developed basically a work plan of how to implement it. This work plan first, as you can see the schedule here, the first step is to revise how this ecosystem approach to fisheries management is being operationalized in other parts of the world. And from that review of that information to get the list of the best practices that has been successful in other areas. Second part of that roadmap is to propose what they call the ecosystems indicators that are relevant to the ICCAT context or ICCAT fisheries. Obviously, these indicators cover several areas from environment, fisheries, the commercial fisheries component, but also from the food webs, the habitat, the links, the ecosystem interaction links between that, and relevance also to the protected and threatened species that are impacted by the fisheries, the activities of the ICCAT fleets. So from all these elements, there are a huge list of indicators that have been proposed, review, and they have been proposed for evaluation. Obviously, when you have an indicator created, then you also have to decide what is the reference point for this indicator. When a certain level, or what level indicates or suggests that they need for a specific management action, either to reduce their influence, the impact, or if the indicator is above certain level, they say this is in a good condition. With those elements then is the plan to propose a framework for better link the ecosystem science with fisheries management. So obviously there is a lot of models we saw last presentation in the session 1 that utilize different ecosystem models, but how to link those to the actual fisheries management, where you had to provide an advice for the managers to take an action. So that framework is also part of the development of the ecosystem approach. Finally, another point that is important is obviously to identify the so-called ecoregions to guide the operationalization of these approaches to the different fisheries management. So that's another area that has been working intensively in the case of the ecosystems. And finally, once you have all these elements put together, the idea is to develop a pilot ecosystem plan for selecting case studies. Once it's approved, reviewed, and evaluated by the scientific committee, then it will be presented to the managers for the action and implementation. Going a little more brief into that, then, for example, in the case of the ecoregions, that to your right, you have a map of what have been the proposed main ecoregions in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean area of concern for ICCAT. And at the same time, in some of the discussions last year, it was suggested that the tropical area may be one of the case studies for which to focus the development of an actual plan, the development of indicators, the gathering of the data necessary to develop these indicators and test it, etc., etc. So this is in some ways the current status of that. The work in progress again include the definition of the ecosystems indicators, develop the pilot ecosystem plan, and finally all these elements are normally summarizing what we call now the ecosystem report card, which is technically the product, kind of an executive summary of what is the status of the main ecosystems in terms of ICCAT fisheries. And this has been already drafted, a proposal that has been submitted for review at the ACRS in 2019. The second draft was approved and technically to be presented to the Commission. However, due to the pandemic, some of the activities have been postponed for the next years. Lately, most of the work again has been concentrated into identify the indicators from the literature, from other approaches in other areas of the world, from other fisheries. From a large list of more than 200 indicators, the group concluded basically to center on 36 indicators. The selection criteria is briefly noted here. Had been working the group into collecting the data, first of all. Second, testing some of these indicators, ranking these indicators in terms of priority and development for approval. And most of these indicators will be part of what is called the management plan. Briefly, here is a schematic diagram of how the ecosystems present this fisheries management plan and develop this fisheries plan. Again, the report card is a summary, a general summary that is presented every year to the Commission to evaluate what is the development and impacts of the fisheries on the different levels. In summary, if I want to briefly continue with this, basically, the ICCAT has started moving towards integrated environmental related uncertainty, interactions, and the potential changes in the sustainable management on Atlantic tuna fisheries resources. And this implementation, both are at the level of the legal framework, meaning at the convention, the management role part, and at the scientific approach to implement ecosystems approach to fisheries management. At the legal framework of the convention, I think it's important to point out the updating of the text and explicitly include the environmental and biodiversity issues. And specifically also the different resolutions and recommendations that have been approved and adopted by the Commission to address environmental impact of tuna fisheries. There are several of them, particularly in the areas of bycatch species like sharks and rays, but also seabirds, sea turtles, and the interaction with marine mammals. Most of these different recommendations are active, have been evaluated, and at the end will be part of this environmental ecosystems approach to fisheries management. Another important part is the adoption of the MSE protocols for fisheries management. And it's important in the sense that it allows to test different management procedures that will be more robust in lieu of the different levels of uncertainty, including environmental uncertainty. Another part from the point of view of the legal framework is that the Commission has approved and invited also to participate with all other programs aiming to reduce the impact fisheries, lost gear, reduce bycatch or threatened species, deal with issues of debris and pollutions, etc. And this is in collaboration with other organizations specialized in some of those areas. In terms of the scientific level, again, the ACRS has actively been engaged in the review and implementation of the ecosystems approach, particularly by the Subcommittee of Ecosystems and Bycatch. We are been working actively in the definition of ecoregions, indicators, and to develop pilot ecosystem plans. Also to present both to the scientific community and the Commission the report card, the ecosystem report card, and to test these indicators and this for the evaluation. The work plan obviously includes schedules for dialogue between scientists and managers and commissioners to define clearly the ecosystem management objectives. This is a step that is important in these discussions. It has also working into integrating the major environmental uncertainty within the MSE protocols for the major tuna fisheries. So that will allow in the management advice to be more robust to this type of uncertainties. Other areas where we can notice is the increase in the number of non-target species assessments, particularly sharks, the interactions with seabirds, plus an active collaboration, as I mentioned before, with scientific organizations in the region that to address main impacts of the tuna fisheries, for example, with the sea turtles, seabirds, participating with the International Whale Commission, the COBE process and bycatch, the United Nations biodiversity programs, and this program in particular also.
Mauricio, we'll have to skip your last slide for time, but we will have your slide available on the website.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for delay. So,
no problem. If you have any questions for Mauricio, we will have time, hopefully about half an hour at the end of the presentations to have a discussion. So again, thank you. We will have your slides up later today.
Thank you.
All right, next up we have Guillermo Compean.
Thank you, Leo.
Robert, there we go.
I will try to stop now. Let me...
Okay, you've been made presenter, so you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, can you see my presentation now?
I can see your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So okay. Dr. Guillermo Compean is a senior scientist emeritus at IATTC. He is from Mexico and holds degrees in biology from the University of Nuevo León and a doctoral degree in biological oceanography from the University of Aix-Marseille. He has worked in the biology and management of tunas for 45 years and has acted as a scientist and director at the Instituto Nacional de la Pesca, and also the head of the Mexican tuna program. And from 2007 to 2020, he was elected as director at the IATTC. So today he'll share his presentation on sustainable fisheries management in the Eastern Pacific Ocean.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, my presentation is a name of the IATTC in an organization that maybe most of you know. We are in charge of the Eastern Pacific Ocean tuna resources. This area is the area of the principal fisheries for tunas in the East Pacific. And my talk will be concentrated in the tropical tunas, yellowfin tuna, skipjack, and big eye. Of course, we have also catches of temperate species, but the principal catches in the area is tropical tunas. The catches of tropical tuna represent, as I mentioned, most of the catches. In this figure, you can see how the catches for yellowfin tuna, big-eyed tuna, and skipjack represent more of the 98% of the total catches. In this figure appear also catches of the Pacific bluefin tuna, just because it's caught by the same purseine fleet. But the catches of Pacific bluefin tuna in the Eastern Pacific average 3,500 tons by the past 10 years, compared with the total catches of over 600,000 metric tons, is relatively very, very low. Other characteristics of the Eastern Pacific Ocean is that most of the catches are concentrated in purseiner. Catches of longliner represent maybe 5%, 4%, and some years 7%, but the last year was 5% or below of the total catches. For skipjack and yellowfin tuna, the catches are below 5,000 tons, and skipjack is not relevant. And the only important catches for long lines is big eye. In the figures, you can see how these catches are changed a lot since the start of the fishery with fishing aggregated devices, and previous to the start of the use of these fishing gears, the catches for long line represented over the 90% of the total catch of big eye tuna. Now is below 30%, and is not really important in terms of the total catches. However, it's important in terms of the stock assessment of the big eye, because represent an important part and also important source of information for the stock assessment. The other characteristic in the fishery for the EPO is that the purseine fishery, that is the dominant fishing gears in the area, as I mentioned, is focused in 3 different types of fishing set of tuna associated with dolphins, set of unassociated tuna, that is known as set on schools, and set on floating objects that can be natural logs or artificial, like fat fishing aggregating devices. So that is now the dominant fishery in the area. Other characteristic of the EPO is that the fishery for tropical tunas in the different type set and the different species is totally mixed, despite that are some dominance of the fishing with dolphins in the northern area of the EPO and the fishing for fat or floating object in the south. Despite that, the fishery is mixed, in particular in the area of the Ecuador, between 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south. The fishery is mixed and is complicated for separate, and is complicated also to separate not only the fishery or the different stock. We has several hypotheses of different stock. However, we consider for the stock assessment and the management that we have a single stock of the 3 tropical tuna species, a single stock for yellowfin tuna, a single stock for skipjack, and a single stock for big eye. You can see here in the table at side how the number of sets was changed in the last years. The percentage of the set on floating object is the dominant in the fishery, and that start in the past 5 years. Before that, the dominant fishery was by type set was the fishing on dolphins, and an associated set changing depending on the oceanographic condition. The number of floating set in the 2019, the last year that is finished, and we have the final record, is relatively low compared with the previous year, with a small reduction. However, this year, 2020, the expectation is that the number will be increased one more time. The form that we manage in the fisheries in the EPO is based in all these characteristics that I mentioned. And with that, we adopt measures to control the fishing mortality each year. Normally, the decision is taken for a period of 3 years, and is applied to all purseine vessels. And we have also some measures for onliner, some limit of catches for big eye in onliner. But the most important is the management of the purseine fishery. This measure was increased each year. We established one closure of the fishery, and in 2004, 2007 was 42 days. After in 2009, we passed to 62 days. And now we have enforced 72 days of closure, because the measure was more and more restrictive, and that is based in the condition of the stock and other changes that I go to talk to you during my presentation. Together with that, also we have a small area. Well, it's relatively small for the size of the EPO, at the west of the Galapagos Island, that is close to the fishery for 30 days. This small area was created with the intention to protect the one area when juvenile or big eye is very common in the set on fishing aggregating devices. This system of measure was adopted because one of the instructions of the Commission is to maintain the stock at the level that producing the maximum sustainable yield. And for that, we use the FMSY, the fishing mortality equivalent to the MSY, as the base for elaborate the recommendation. And this recommendation can be considered as a days of fishing estimated from the FMSY and adopted as an open fishing season with some closure. As I mentioned, as you can see in this figure, this measure was more and more restrictive. For 2020, the last year in which is in operation, the last resolution is exactly the same that I have it in the previous year, 72 days, and with the option of 2 possible periods of closure, one from July to October, and the other in November to January of the next year. And the intention of these 2 closure that is chosen by the countries is based in the fact that are not any effect if we separate the closure in 2 periods, but it's very helpful for the industry to maintain their supply and organize the form to operate in their fleets. And that is very important for the country because as you can see, it's very different, the fishery from the north to the south, despite that is mixed in the equatorial area. And together with that closure in 2020, also we have some limitation for the active number of fats, and this number is based in the size of the poor seiner, defined by class, the definition developed by the Commission, class 1 to 3, 4 to 5, and class 6 with 2 different sizes, and a different number of active fat that can be allowed for the specific year. As you can see the numbers, this number was not developed totally based in the scientific advice. It was in reality, these numbers are bigger than the average used regularly by the vessels. However, it was a consensus decision by the Commission. The excess of capacity in the cruise fin fleet, this excess that grown very fast from the 95 to now, and in which we reached the highest level of capacity in all the story of the fishery, was the origin of this increasing days of closure, because the growth of the fishing fleet was in some moment out of control, and we reached these high levels. As I say, the highest in all the history of the fishery. And also these levels is believed by the staff, scientific staff, that is a menace for the sustainability of the fishery. And based in the stock assessment developed by the scientific staff, we recommend the increase in days of closure. But that is the principal origin of the decision. Also, a second reason for increase the closure was that the observation that the fishing mortality of the 3 species has increased since 2000 to 2020. In the past 20 years, we observe a very, very strong increase in the number of floating object sets. You can see in this figure, in the red line, how the floating object set was increasing very, very strong in the past 20 years. And this increase in floating object set is not observed for other type of set, not in non-associated, and also is not observed in dolphin sets. And this also is other concern for the Commission, and is what is part of also of the decision for increase the measures. Together with the management of the fishery of tropical tunas by the closure of the fishery by the vida, we developed also at the Commission one scheme for limit the entry of more fishing capacity to the EPO. This scheme was adopted in 2002. The limit agreed to limit the purseine fleet capacity. In that form, we control the size and the fleet capacity through one regional vessel register. If one vessel is not in the regional vessel register, it's not allowed to participate in the EPO fisheries for tropical tunas. However, this system limits just the capacity, not limited the catches. For that is that we need to consider this limit as complementary to the other conservation and management measures that restrict catches, like the closure of the fishery. The both work together for maintain the fishing mortality at the levels recommended by the stock assessment. More or less, in June 2005, the Commission also adopted a plan for regional management of fishing capacity. The principal objective of the plan is to establish a comprehensive program for managing the capacity and to ensure the long-term sustainability of the fisheries covered by the IATTC. This plan was adopted as a plan, but is not yet applied to the EPO. It's something that we need to start in some moment, but depends of many decisions that is very complicated in terms of the politic adopted by the members of the Commission. I got to talk more about that. The Antiqua Convention that was adopted in 2010 was a new convention in which we tried to modernize the Commission, because, as you know, the IATTC was created in 1949. It's a very old convention. And thanks to that Antiqua Convention, now the Commission has a very clear legal authority to work with bycatch issues. We have one very clear article that allows the Commission to adopt as necessary conservation and management measures and recommendation for species belonging to the same ecosystem and that are affected by the fishing for or dependent or on or associated with the fish stock covered by the Convention, with a view to maintaining or restoring population of such species above levels of which their reproduction may become seriously threatened. Thanks to that, the Commission in the last years was adopted more and more measures to protect and to reduce the effect of the fishery in the species that are part of the same ecosystem. In between all these actions also are action more specific. And in the past year, the Commission adopted a Tuna Dolphin program. It's very known by everybody. It's a program specific for managing the interaction with dolphins in the EPO fishery. We established a working group in bycatch in 1997, was previous to the Antiqua Convention, but this bycatch group was reinforced by the Antiqua Convention. And we have many resolutions on bycatch for sea turtle, sharks, sea beetles, whale, sharks, for many species related with the fishery. At the same time, the Commission worked a lot in developing fishing gears for bycatch reduction, and also not only fishing gears, also protocols, and adopt also protocols that were developed in other broader organizations like ICCAT or WCPFC, IATTC, and we adopted these protocols and as a part of our commission. And in maybe 10 years ago, we developed a specific research program for fats. I don't remember exactly what year, but it's more or less 10 years. And this specific fat research program is very successful now. We have a lot of information. Never is enough, of course, and we're working with the members for improve this work and improve the recommendation that are published from this work.
Guillermo, I'm going to have to stop your presentation so we have enough time for questions at the end. But thank you very much. I will put a plug for our next session where we talk about Earth observations to reduce bycatch. So I think that's this is a great background for it. Thank you. And again, we'll have the slides up later today. All right. So our last presenter is Mr. Alejandro Aganuzzi, and you should be able to share your screen now. So Alejandro is currently the global coordinator for the Common Oceans Tuna Project and the ABNJ program, one of the 4 projects of the Common Oceans program, which is funded by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He is a biologist originally from Argentina who did postgraduate studies at the University of Washington, specializing in mathematical modeling of ecological systems. He has worked for the IATTC, the Indo-Pacific Tuna Management and Development Program, and he has served as the Deputy Secretary and the Executive Secretary, as well as Science Manager of the IOTC, and also an advisor to the Republic of Seychelles. So today he'll be sharing a personal perspective on sustainable tuna fisheries management. And I did see your screen for a second.
Yeah, it's, can you see it well?
Yes, I could see your screen.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that introduction and the opportunity from Blue Planet to speak to all this audience, among which I see quite a few friends from some years ago. It's really nice to meet you again, even virtual. One thing that I wanted to clarify is that the ABNJ, the Common Oceans ABNJ program, has been funded by GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and FAO has been the coordinator of a very rich partnership that includes all the tuna RFMOs, together with NGOs, CSOs, academia, etc. So anyway, I have a short presentation because I wanted more than anything else to provoke a few ideas and questions. And this presentation, it's the result of the years of experience with virtually all the RFMOs, especially the tuna RFMOs, but especially the last 5 or 6 years with the project. The Tuna project involving all the Tuna RFMOs has given us a really nice global vision of perception of all the differences and the similarities in the problems of and the challenges and the solutions that all these RFMOs are facing or developing. A few observations. Number one is that the RFMOs continue to be the option for managing fisheries in the ABNJ. That's, to many of you, might seem a truism, but actually there are significant portions of the environmental community that believe that the RFMOs are something from the past. And that is because in many cases, they miss the main feature, is that the RFMOs have been able to reinvent themselves and they continue to evolve in response to changing conditions, to changing memberships, expanding memberships and mandates, and also as a response to the structure of incentives and disincentives that determine the direction and the speed of the evolution. And in particular, we would note, and we notice, the market incentives that have generated things as eco-labeling or restrictions to access to certain products at some of the major markets. I will go back into that in more detail, but the overall conclusion and what we feel right now as we started developing the project for a second phase of the Common Oceans ABNJ Tuna project is that, yes, we are at a crossroads. As it's a moving crossroads, if you wish. Yes, we still have a half-empty glass. There are many things that need to be developed and done and challenges to be met, but this glass has been filling up slowly but surely over the past 10, 15 years. To see in which way these trends, we have seen these trends evolve. Let me go for, we work with a perception that these RFMO processes are, can be, there are 3 steps that we can identify. In the process, they start with a generation of scientific advice or generation management advice from the scientific community. Obviously, this starts with data collection for assessment of the status of the resources and other relevant ancillary information, such as impacts on the environment, and that they allow them to form a management advice that then is passed to the decision-making body, who has the responsibility to translating that management advice into management actions. That blue arrow that we see from one layer to the one step to the next, it's a very important in this particular case because it's where we have seen this is the interactions between science and decision making, that where we have seen a lot of development, such as the management strategy evaluation that Mauricio was talking about. The third step that we think it's extremely important is once we have the body, the decision-making body making those, agreeing to those management actions, then we have a compliance process. Those management actions need to be implemented, and the quality and the extent of if needs to be monitored in order to understand where we are going, and obviously to take action if those steps are not being taken. This is probably the most important of all the steps. I mean, you may have, and this could be very controversial, but if you don't have compliance, if the member countries don't do what they have agreed to do, then it doesn't matter what you do with the science and the decision making. And this has been a really complicated issue for many years. I remember in my first years as an executive secretary, some of the member countries would not even remember what decisions had been adopted at the annual meetings, and that was because there was very little consequences of a lack of compliance. So that has changed radically since about 10 years ago. Anyway, going back into each of these steps in more detail to see what are the opportunities and the challenges. In terms of the science, we still see that the data analysis evaluation is still driven mostly by fisheries data or fisheries dependent data. There are a few means to independently verify some of these data, And there is, unfortunately, in many cases, poor data quality that confounds the messages contained in the data. It's not unusual to see different sources of data being catch per unit of efforts or size frequency distributions that the models interpret in a completely conflicting way. And therefore, you have the additional level of uncertainty that having conflicting messages being given by different sources of data. We hope, sure, there is innovation in data collection. There are possible data, semi-independent fisheries data, such as tagging data, but still they need to conform to certain assumptions. Innovation, it's great in the sense, in the data collection, in the sense that we could collect massive amounts of data. And of course, people have been well, making a lot of promotion from remote sensing data, such as AIS or synthetic aperture radar. And what type of information can we extract those data? I think this would be in the future an area of active research. The other thing is obviously it's what well, we have seen that it's happening in many RFMOs. Is implementation of a precautionary approach via the management strategy evaluation that leads to the adoption of management procedures. Mauricio also showed us the great example of ICCAT, how it has slowly moving towards embracing uncertainty and moving away from a pure stock assessment paradigm. This is an advancement that it's happening in all the RFMOs, and it was one of our main objectives in the implementation of the first phase of the Common Oceans program, in trying to accompany and encourage the RFMOs to pursue this goal. There are a couple of things that are important here. Is as we said, this has been operating in that interface between science and management. And that has, in many RFMOs, what we have seen is a much rich communication between the scientists and the scientific community and the management. In some cases, before, it was the presentation of the scientific bodies was limited to the chairperson of the scientific committee presenting the report and discussing with the members. Now we have bodies that encourage a dialogue, that encourage, yes, that encourage a better conversation between management and scientists. And related to this is the advances that we have seen in the implementation of the ecosystem approach. Tuna bodies in general, tuna RFMOs are behind its deep sea counterparts in the implementation of the ecosystem approach. And that is, it's not surprising given that the deep sea fisheries in general have a much more interaction with the habitat and generate a lot more concern about vulnerable ecosystems that they might impact with their fishing operations. But the thing is, well, the same could be said of many of the activities of the tuna fisheries, including impacts maybe from floating objects, maybe from particular gears like gillnet gears in certain oceans. And a full implementation of the ecosystem approach, it's still there to be taken or to be developed. The good thing is that the experience of the management strategy evaluation in all the RFMOs have smoothed out the road for a proper discussion of how we implement the ecosystem approach. And again, I go back to the example of ICCAT, in which they are almost there. They have an ecosystem report card. they're talking about ecosystem indicators, and they're talking about reference points. Now, the thing that it will be missing is the decision rules. Have the commissions really agree not only to discuss the science related to the ecosystem approach, but also to discuss what to do when critical values of those indicators are reached. And that it could be in the form of decision rules, similar to the ones applied as management procedures, that could be tested by a peculiar, by a different form of an operating model. But in general, we see a lot of improvements in terms of bycatch and other impacts. We see also in the new, in the revised formulations, such as the Antiqua Convention and the amendment to the ICCAT Convention, we see that they are accepting and they are embracing as part of the mandate the consideration to the impacts of fishing activities on the environment. This 15 years ago, it was a much more controversial issue. So we are moving ahead. In terms of the management, the first thing that we have seen is, well, an increased participation of the coastal states. You saw that ICCAT has 53 members plus 6 cooperating parties, 75% of which are developing states. The same is the case of the WCPFC, of IATTC, and IATTC, of course. Probably the only one that has a majority of developed states as members is CCSBT. But the point is that one of the things that I noticed, especially because there were a number of years that I had not attended certain RFMO annual meetings, is that when I returned, I saw a much richer participation of the coastal state. And richer is not only to say things or to say speeches or opening statements, but to participate in the decisions and to have very clear understanding of what would be the consequences of certain proposals that are on the table. This has changed things a lot. One opportunity for the future is that one of the constant criticisms of the decision process is that it takes place only for once a year in most cases, and that you have a limited number of days in which to consider a lot of potential decisions, and therefore you got often management measures that are discussed past midnight and with multiple mistakes or multiple errors, or simply because you, given the prevalence of a consensus rule, you don't have enough time to discuss them properly, and they get deferred for the following year. Now, what we are experiencing, especially this year, whether we like it or not, and we don't, but there are the possibilities of having online meetings, more concentrated, probably with fewer interventions, which encourages intersectional work and collaboration, and the possibility of having more than multiple decisions instances throughout the year. You may take, say, proposals divided into packages and analyze it through online meetings through different times. The same with MSC, EFM, and even allocation procedures, although we will not touch those, but there are the possibility of having pre-agreed approaches for facing those difficult decisions. Again, the people are not scared now of engaging to those different processes. And clearly what we have is we need a review of the efficacy of the management actions, which connects us to the compliance and enforcement process. We have much better compliance than we had since 2010 because we had compliance committees now in all the major RFMOs. And those compliance committees have moved from a really smooth consideration of what is hampering compliance to analyze the performance of country by country. That enhances transparency and accountability.
Alejandro, I'll have to stop you there. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
We just have, yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Again, we'll have this online later today. We have 15 minutes for questions, and you had said that you know, online meetings have opened this opportunity for us to all meet, and so I want to make sure that we at least get to start this conversation today, and I hope that it continues outside of this meeting. So I do see that we have one question in the chat. Hassan, if you're still here, you could unmute and ask it yourself if you'd like. If not, I could read it for you. It's a question for Mauricio. It's also in the chat if you'd like to read it. Hassan says, we know that there is consequences to expanding assessments and management within the operational assessment process, because additional data sets can mean additional uncertainty that affects the final assessment results. Also, an expanded assessment scope may require increased resources to maintain the additional data inputs. So what is the trade-offs ICCAT is considering as they expand stock assessments and management to account for ecosystem, climate change, and socioeconomic considerations?
Thanks, Leah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I will respond, excuse me, the question in two components. The first one is what is the trade-off? I think the trade-off are important in the sense that, as pointed out by Alejandro, the large uncertainty of the traditional stock assessments paradox creates a lot of problems for both the resources, but also for the industry, for the managers, because suddenly you have a resources, you have a large changes in catches, reduction, investments in terms of fleet, etc., etc. So the advantage of these new approaches, of the management strategy evaluation particularly, is that in some ways you can test management approaches. You can do a test in long term, meaning 10 years. What if we do this? What if we apply this technique? What if we take this decision? Something that it cannot be done in the current single stock assessment. So that's one of the trade-off. In other words, it's a balance between the different components and be able to, if you want to maintain certain levels of cash, what are the advantages? But if you don't want to reduce substantially, for example, the fleet, etc. That's point one. Point two also is that these new approaches allows to identify the major sources of uncertainty and how those interact, and being able to focus then the research, all the resources that are for research, both scientifically but also economically, into those areas where a large, put it this way, a large improvement can be done, can be achieved through this investment of these resources, and substantially then reduce the uncertainty in the models. So I think in general, the trade-off are that part of the elements. And the last but not less important component is, as mentioned also by Alejandro, is the active participation of the stakeholders in the decision process. Unfortunately, in the traditional stock assessment, it's been seen in some ways one-way direction, where the scientists produce a result, managers take a decision, and then the stakeholders, they had to adopt to the decision. In this way, this process allows the feedback between the two or the three elements: stakeholders, managers, and science. And I think those are the main trade-off. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mauricio. I open questions to everyone. If you want, you could go ahead and unmute your mic and ask it. Right, I have another question in the chat. This one's for Alejandro. From Hassan, Earth observations are now widely available and accessible. Global Fishing Watch is a good example. Do you think that these data have a potential to improve sustainable tuna management?
Yes, indeed, but perhaps, and this is a very, very personal, I'm not reflecting the FAO position at all, but I think that not as much as the proponents expect. The problem that I have with the Global Fishing Watch, for example, is that it's very difficult to connect to actual fishing activities. It's very easy to falsify the data, and it's also very easy to turn off an automatic identification system, an AIS, and it doesn't give us information. I would have loved to have that, for example, if it can be accompanied by a precise catch data, which is necessarily not the case. Certainly for compliance, because it's not such a tamper-proof system, it's not going to be very useful. For developing catch and effort data, maybe, but I don't think that we are there yet.
Great, thank you. Guillermo, do you have perspectives on Earth observations for IATTC?
Okay, thank you, Leah. Yes, what I want to underline is what Alejandro mentioned. Without any decision or action by the members of the organization, the science, the stock assessment, and the recommendation is for nothing. And that is the most important part of the management process. Without decisions or actions, we can produce the best science, the best recommendation, but don't have any effect in the sustainability of the stock or sustainability of the fisheries at all. That is maybe the most important problem that we already have. We need to develop new forms to deal with that. I was very happy to listen some aspect mentioned by Alejandro, for example, the need to more frequent meetings with the members, in particular with the coastal state. In particular, at the IATTC, we have a very good participation of the coastal state. All the participants in the fisheries are members of the commission or not members cooperating. And for that, we are all in the same table for discuss, in the same fora for discuss the management of the resources. But the important is to achieve something. That is the problem. And I believe that under the condition that we pass now will be more complicated, very complicated. It's, as I mentioned in my conversation with Alejandro at the beginning, in the IATTC, we are in a very unusual situation. Yeah, we don't have presential meetings. Some decisions need to be done by presential meetings, and it's complicated, and we need to change all of that. But for change all of this, we need a political commitment by the members. However, I coincide with Alex that the best platform to deal with that is the RFMOs. That is my general comment.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I have another question for you from Manuela. Guillermo, any knowledge on how the evolution of the number of FADs in the Eastern Pacific Ocean since the 2000s? Does IATTC have access to this information or has planned any data collection program for assessing the number of FADs?
Yeah, that is part of the problem. We have only access to some information. It's very symptomatic. In our commission, we have the best information in terms of the catches, in terms of the landings, in terms of the operation of the vessels, because we are the only organization with our own data collection system for surface fisheries, for seiner in that case. However, we don't have access to the full information of FATS, despite that the commission was developed along of their history, very, very strong confidential rules. The information is very, very well protected. It's used only for science. Despite that, the stakeholder, the industry, argue that, not all, of course, but most of them argue that this information can be used for commercial interests, and they don't want to accept that the commission don't have any commercial interest, and that my answer is we don't have access to the full information that we need for produce the best advice to the commission.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Maria. Can you, wait, this question's for Alejandro, but anyone could answer. So you mentioned a 3-step model for management. First, generation of advice, second, decision-making, and third, compliance process. Regarding the generation of advice for managing not only most commercial species, but also impacts on bycatch species for the wider ecosystem, what has been the major achievements and what continues to be the major challenge in generating quality advice?
Well, in terms of the major achievements, I think one of the things that we have achieved the most is trying to bring the people together into a more cohesive way of tackling with impacts of fishing activities. We have done that with throughout the implementation of the first phase of our project by bringing together, for example, people across the southern oceans, for 3 oceans, to bring together information on poor beagle sharks and come up with the first stock assessment in the world of poor beagle shark that included all the data. There are multiple other little achievements, but the thing is, meaning that there are conservation management measures in some cases implemented at both sides of the ocean, like in the Pacific, that are consistent and for specifically target conservation of some of the most vulnerable sharks or marine turtles or other species. In terms of major challenge is that we're not getting probably the information at the proper level of at the proper scale and frequency for the management actions. And I think in particular of climate change. Climate change is, and we are starting a big program to try to develop briefings for the members of the RFMOs on the possible implications on the major species and on the environment of climate change. One thing that people tend to forget is that if we have impacts of climate change, not only on the shifts in distribution of the species, but also affecting the productivity of the species, then a major assumption of a stationarity of the productivity parameters that goes in many stock assessment methods, it's gone. We need to throw away data that are older than 15 or 20 years because we cannot use it any longer to predict the productivity that it's completely different nowadays.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that big challenge. And it's something that we talked about during the last session about species distribution shifts. Mauricio, would you like to comment on behalf of IATTC on major achievements and major challenges?
Thanks, Leah, but my comment will be on behalf of ICCAT.
Excuse me, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I think, and thanks to Maria Jose, because most of her work actually has been reflected in my presentation. She has been integral part of the subcommittee of ecosystems. I think, and still in the words from Alejandro, there has been a lot of progress recently in the RFMOs, particularly in the scientific bodies, to tackle the issue of ecosystems approach implementation. Still, the source of the data, the collection of data, both from the catches, for example, of bycatch species, the fishing effort distributions, etc., there is still a lack of data. And when you go back historically, it's even worse, the situation. But I think that's part of the progress that has been moving, recognizing some of the new alternatives to collect data, new methodologies to integrate this data, and in combination with and working with other specialized groups, like, for example, climatologists, ecosystems specialists, etc., is a better approach to integrate this ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So it's not only the task of the ICCAT community, for example, but it's to integrate from the point of view of ICCAT all other specialists and other experts from other areas, and how to create that framework of how to move from base ecosystem models to be applied to management models. And I know that it still is a long way to go, but I think we are making progress in that sense. And I think that's the major challenge right now we have. Thank you.
Hey, Leah,
Yes,
can I ask a question?
last one.
Yeah, okay. Well, there is I put it right there in the chat, but I think this is maybe the last. So this is to Mauricio or Alejandro, or anyone can respond. Any progress on developing reference point that takes in consideration climate change? I mean, all these shifts, all these things that we've been showing in the first session. At some point, we would like to have some of that consideration into the stock assessment, basically the output in terms of reference point to support advice.
Yes, thank you. I have two specific examples. The first one, in the case of the swordfish, North Atlantic swordfish, it has been throughout different type of analysis correlated the influence of the oceanographic condition changes related to the ENSO, El Niño effect, into the availability and the catchability of North Atlantic swordfish by the longline fleet gear mostly. So in the last couple of assessments, although there are single stock assessments, they had been included this index of the ENSO El Niño that has been able to be generated from the oceanographic models, to include that directly into the assessment. And actually in the MSE process is right now included as one of the major sources of uncertainties. So there are possibilities to integrate some of the specific climatological and environmental signals into the evaluation of the stocks and to the potential impacts. In similar way, has been integrated some of the effects in management strategy evaluation for the Atlantic bluefin tuna related to the changes in the so-called regime shift, when it's basically translated into changes in the productivity of, in terms of recruitment of the stock. Seems to be that before 1980s in general, the capacity of a unit of spawners was much higher in terms of producing recruitments than it will show up later on in the stock. In the recent years, most likely associated with some changes in the environment that not directly affect the recruitment, but may they affect the prey that fits on that, then the successful recruitment has been modified. So those are the specific changes, but there are, in other words, there is a need to carry out those studies, carry out how, for example, if increases in shifts over temperature or in general temperature or changes in the currents will affect the prey relationship between the different the different elements in the ecosystems. Obviously, most of the tunas are what we call top predators. How the distribution, how the biomass is being affected by those changes in the climatological change. We need to still study more the links between the different components.
Thank you very much. And Mauricio, if you don't mind, we probably may share with Leah some of those papers that really address the climate, basically anything that regime shift or climate information that we know into the stock assessment process, or I mean, developing those reference point or those advice that you mentioned, the MSC. So it would be great to share those papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and yes, I want to say that under ICCAT, all the discussions and reports of the meetings are available in the webpage of ICCAT. And as you mentioned, for the subcommittee of ecosystems will be the initial point where you can find those, but I will post it in the chat, the direct links for those publications. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for our speakers for an engaging conversation. We're unfortunately out of time, but I hope you continue these conversations offline, and I hope to see you at a future session of our workshop. I will stay on a little longer if people wanted to put links or continue the chat, but the presentation part is over, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thanks, Leah.
Leah, if I may.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
Oh, I think Hassan left.
Hassan, oh, I guess. Oh, no, he's still here.
I'm here.
No, Hassan is here. Look, there are also examples about regime shifts in the IATTC world. Especially the yellowfin would go often through regime shifts, normally after a strong El Niño event, an ENSO event. So there are examples there. There are examples also of clear shifts in distribution, but that is not, to me, the main problem. The most problematic of all things is the changes in productivity, because I don't think, I mean, it will, many years will pass before we have the information on any ecosystem structure, pelagic ecosystem structure, to try to come up with first principles like changes in predator-prey relationships or things of that sort. We will have to try to detect those regime shifts by measuring certain properties of the stock. And we all know that how difficult it is to get evidence. You will need quite a few years of data, and the quality of the data we're getting, it does not allow that. So it will be difficult. The thing that we need, we can always use the operating models of the MSC in a special mode in order to explore the consequences of making the wrong assumptions, like making assumptions about the productivity that are no longer sustained. And that try to cast it into alternative management actions that would be admissible or preferable depending on the assumptions that you are making. That is one important value of the operating model. Another one, it's what Mauricio was saying also. You can measure the rate of learning for that you will get, and someone was mentioning adaptive management, which is precisely that. I mean, you try to also incorporate the rate of learning that you will get on the properties of the resource, depending on the management strategies that you use. Some management strategies are more conservative, but also they do not allow you to learn more quickly about what is the true status of the productivity of the stock.
Right. Yeah, no, Alejandro, I hear you. I mean, I agree with all you said. And the challenge is that there is a trade-off to be made. And maybe prioritizing that process where and when to really tackle those issues. Not all, you cannot do it for everything, for all species.
No,
maybe,
exactly.
you know, yep. So like in Indian Ocean, as you know, probably saw that presentation I made with Francis, that, yeah, there is a huge challenge, and there is no, you know, the things are shifting every time. The purseines fleet are moving from one side to another side, and if you don't know the recruitment next year, it's challenging for to maintain that resource. IATTC is having a hard time. Basically, it's the fact that they cannot translate what they know already about the changes into the management process. That's the problem. The translation is very hard. It's very challenging. I think trying. I think something. Yep. Go ahead.
That has been my point, and in fact, it's one of the things that we had pushed hard through the project is to try to work with the scientific communities of the RFMOs to say, please be more proactive in taking it to the managers. We are having really good science being generated, and Mauricio illustrated some of that great science, but it doesn't get translated into actions by the decision-making bodies.
Well, I mean, the reason, Alejandro, because this process is rigid. The stock assessment process is rigid. The management is rigid. And I think only these recent years you see a little bit of flexibility, but that flexibility is still challenging. But MSC is really enabling that at least that discussion to happen. But we don't really see much of the translation yet into the management per se. Not yet, but I think it's moving toward that direction.
There are some of the best ecosystem research that I've seen was done by IATTC, and it was done. I started working for IATTC in 1984, and the scientists there were already making some fantastic work on trophic relationships that they still haven't been translated into any particular management actions. So the part of the problem is also that there are many members that are happy with the status quo, that they would be happy for the research to advance, but they would not like to entertain any proposal that could alter their decision-making patterns.
Right, right, exactly. And it's not only for tuna. It's yeah, for many species that we manage, that's the process. And the problem is, like I said again, is the rigid process. And every time we do, because it's costly. It's costly to move from an operational settings. That's what probably my question, the first question is, that you have an operational assessment and everything there. Coming and trying to little bit change that operational settings, it's costly. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a lot of resources, and you have to dedicate people. As soon as you add another parameter into the whole that mix, you need to have people sitting there and working on it, bringing data, maintaining data. All that process is, I found it to be, for now, I'm still, we are still challenging, at least in NOAA, to figure out the best way to do it. But we're moving toward that direction. I mean, there is a lot of things we're doing, but it's like you said, it's not there yet in different places, different areas. It depends on where you are and what species you're dealing with.
Yeah, and which countries you're dealing with. There are some countries that got really scary if you talk about ecosystem approach. Anyway. Anyway, thank you very much one more time.
Thank you, Alejandro.
It's a unique opportunity, and thanks, Hassan, for invitation and the.
Thank you. Thank you. I look forward probably to have more discussion as we move forward. I think this has provided us a platform. This GeoBlue Planet is really a good platform for us to to interact, and then bring some of the different sides of the stakeholders to be part of this discussion as we move forward.
Totally. If we
Thank
are
you.
going to progress this, it has to be a joint effort.
Thank you,
Thanks
sir,
a lot.
and thank you for coming and sharing with us all the good stuff that you guys are doing. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you all the team from GeoBlue Planet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Hassan and Leah, and all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.